Okay, this video continues on with some of the properties that you can use to format text. And the next one we're going to look at is color. In the example here you see it's just color as the property. It's not text dash color like a lot of the other properties are, but the value is separated by a colon from the property, and there's a couple ways that you can actually display this color. You can use the hexadecimal notation, which is what's being used here. It always starts with a pound sign and then is followed by 3 sets of hexadecimal numbers. Each 2 digits represents red, green, and blue. So in this example, 66 represents red, 00 represents the number for green, and FF represents the value of the blue. When they repeat like this, when each of the 3 groups, all 3 groups have to repeat, when they do repeat like this, the 6600FF, then you can shorten that to just pound 60F. You could also use the RGB function, and the RGB, it's just RGB, and then your parentheses inside of that, then you need to give the value for red, green, and blue separated by a comma. You can do this one of 2 ways. You can use the numeric value, that's between 0 and 255, or you can use the percentage. The other way that you can represent color is by basic HTML colors. Those are the ones that are named. These are just some of the names on the bottom here, not all of them. So if we just look at a quick sample here, we've got a paragraph. Paragraph has a class of 1. The span has a class of color, and that's where there is something writing in red here. And if we look at the style sheet for this, the 1 does not have a style, but through the body we're actually setting the color of the entire page to black. And then in the span here we're using FF0000, which could also be written as pound F00, but that's the hexadecimal value for red. So you can view this then, and you see indeed that the text that was in the span has been turned red. The text align property. This works just like the deprecated align attribute that we looked at earlier in the course. So you want to do away with the align attribute now and start using text align in order to align your controls. It aligns the text within its containing element or the browser window. So we haven't really talked about container elements yet, but a container element would be an element that is the parent of whatever it is that you want to align, like a paragraph tag or a divider or one of the new tags for sections of the page. The values that you can have, left, right, and center, those are pretty much self-explanatory. The justify actually spreads the width across the entire thing. It's justified left and right. I don't usually like to use that on the web because there's too many factors that go into it that can go wrong with it. It's used a lot in print, but you can use it if you want to. And then CSS 3 has added start and end, where start just aligns the inline contents with the start of the line box, and the end aligns it with the end of the line box. So they're very similar to right and left, but not quite the same. The vertical align. This is useful when you're working with inline elements, in particular images and portions of text. It's going to control that vertical positioning within its containing element. There are several possible values that are listed in a chart on page 212 and 213, and this property also may accept inherit, a length, and a percentage value. We can take a quick look at that chart, and you can see all the values then that you can use: baseline, sub, super, top, text top, middle, bottom, text bottom. These are all the different values and what they do. The ones you're going to probably see used mostly are the sub and super, that's subscript and superscript, as well as the top and the bottom. The text decoration. This accepts underline, overline, line through, blink, and none. You can also use multiple keywords if you want. So if you want something underlined and overlined, you could do that. Notice that as opposed to the font family, there is no comma here. It's just a space separating the two values. And this should be ended with a semicolon. But no comma when you put these together. It's just a single space between them. And we'll look at just a couple of these. The underline, overline, line through, and using the combo. If we look at the style sheet for these, you can see the text decoration is underlined, text decoration is overline, line through, and here's the combo that has both the underline and the overline. So we look at this in a browser, you can see those variations. Now one place where you really see this used a lot is on anchor tags. If we were to add an anchor tag in here, notice I have them in a paragraph tag here, and then my anchor tag, it's just going to say a normal link by href is set to £1 so it doesn't go anywhere. But if we view this in our browser, we see the link in the normal blue and underline that it's getting from the browser's style sheet. If we go back to that code though, notice that I've added a class to the anchor tag, and the class is none. This has to be applied directly to the anchor tag as opposed to the paragraph tag in this case, but I'm applying the class of none. So in my style sheet, I'm going to add an anchor tag with the class of none. And then I'm going to add to that the text decoration and set that value to none as well. So with that then, if I go back to my page and refresh it, we now no longer have that underline. I must have hit an extra button there, fat fingers to get that Z in there, but you see that the underline now is gone from the link. It's still a link, it's still blue, you can still see the finger pointing to it as if it's a link, but the underline is gone. And you see that used for links quite a bit. And then we also have the text indent property. This just enables you to indent the first line of text within an element. If we look at 11 here, we'll see that we have two different paragraphs. The first one doesn't have anything, it's just going to be a regular paragraph, and the second one has a class of indent. Now, you may remember, or you may have noticed, hopefully both, that a paragraph tag in HTML is a block level element, which means that it normally adds a blank line above it and a blank line below it. Other than that, every line is flush left, and they're just separated by the space. So each paragraph just starts with a space between it. If I was to do away with this, and I'm just going to put another letter in here to kind of make this not work, if we save this and look at this, you'll see both paragraphs starting over on the left hand side. If I change my browser and they went to multiple lines, you would see how each paragraph would go and we'd have that space. That's because the paragraph being a block level element. If we go back to our code here, and I'll get rid of the X that disqualified that style sheet and take a look at the style sheet, then we have a text indent for that second paragraph of 3em. So that's 3 times whatever the size of the text is. So now when we go back and look at this again, refresh this, you'll see that we have an indentation like you would probably use if you were writing something for an English class or writing a letter to somebody. Then we have a text shadow property. This is to create a drop shadow, which is a dark version of the word just behind and slightly offset of it. The value for this property can be a little complicated only because it takes several values to actually make it work. The first value that you need to give it is what color is this shadow going to be. The next two lengths specify how far from the original text drop shadow should fall. The first one being the X value, the second one being the Y value. The third specifies how blurred the drop shadow should be. So with all of that, we need to take a look at an example on this one. So we simply have an H1, has a class of shadow. This heading should have a drop shadow under it. Nothing exciting there. The exciting part is in the CSS. We have our text shadow, our class, and we have the text shadow property, but then notice that the first value we give it is a dark gray. The second is the offset for X. The third, the offset for Y. And 3, how blurred should it look? It's of note to point out here also that these are 10 pixel by and 10 pixels each. If you look at your screen, the upper left-hand corner of your browser window is 0, 0. Positive numbers for X go down. Positive values for Y go to the right. Negative values move the X up or the Y to the left. So if we look at the sample then, you can see the drop shadow then behind the actual heading itself. Now just to play games, go back to our style sheet and we'll put a minus on both of these. Save that. Refresh our page and you can see now that the shadow goes up and to the left. The text transform. This is just a transformation property. It enables you to specify the case of the content of an element. None, it just appears the way it's typed. Capitalize, if you use that value, it capitalizes the first letter of every word. Uppercase makes everything uppercase. Lowercase makes everything lowercase. And a capitalize, you might think it's the first letter of the sentence. It's not sentence case, but word case. So every word is going to be capitalized. The first letter of every word will be capitalized. So if we look at 13, you can see we just 4 paragraphs. First one is none, capitalize, uppercase, lowercase. In the case of the one we're turning to uppercase, we have it in sentence caps. In the case of the one that we're going to turn to lowercase, we have it in all caps. So if we look at the style sheet, the text transformation, none, capitalize, uppercase, lowercase. Again, don't forget semicolon or colon and then semicolon to end it. Quick look. So this is the first one that was none, so it just appeared the way it was. The second one, each letter of the word, even the small prepositions, the first letter is still capitalized. We took the sentence case, changed it to all caps, took the all caps, changed it to all lowercase. Letter spacing. This gives you some more distance or space between each individual letters. Designers will refer to this as tracking. You'll hear some people erroneously refer to this as kerning. This is not kerning. That's a totally different subject that you can't do with CSS at this point. But this is tracking. This is the space between the letters. Loose tracking would indicate that there's a lot of space between letters. Tight tracking would refer to something that's more squeezed together. They're very close together to each other. And no tracking is just the normal for whatever that font would be. You are most likely going to specify this in pixels or in EM, and you can specify that an element should have no tracking using the keyword normal. So letter spacing colon normal as opposed to none. So letter spacing normal or letter spacing and how much spacing do you want to add. So we're going to have 4 samples again. The normal sentence spacing, 2 pixels between each letter, half an EM between each letter, and 1 pixel removed from each letter or from the space between the letters. So if we look at our styles, Notice there's no 1 because that's just normal. Letter spacing, we're going to put 3px. The second one, we're going to add half an EM, 0.5 EM. That's like negative 50%. Notice there's no S, it's just EM. And then minus 1 pixel. So in our browser, you can see then this is normal at the top here. You can compare it to everything else. This is actually 3 pixels that we added instead of 2, but that's 3 pixels between each one. Here's half an EM between each one, and here's taking a pixel away from each one. So you can see the difference between those. Can also do word spacing. This is the same as letter spacing, only it's the gap between words. Its value should be, again, some unit of length. 3 samples here. The standard gap between each word, adding 20 pixel gap between each word, and taking a pixel away from between each word. Style sheets again. This time we're using word spacing, adding the 20 pixels, word spacing minus 1 pixel. So looking at this in our browser, you can see the effect of adding those 20 pixels between each word, and the first and top are pretty much the same except for the minus 1 instead of standard, but you can see how each one of those is a little bit tighter in between each word than it is up here. So this has a little bit more space than this. You can also control white space. Now keep in mind from earlier in the course, white space inside of your page document where you got your code is like free space. You can add a whole bunch of extra lines to make it more readable, a whole lot of extra space, and it just takes multiple spaces and combines them down into one space. Multiple lines, empty lines, just come back as a space. If you wanted to have extra spaces, you would have to use the non-breaking space character entity or the pre-element. So with a white space, you have 3 options. The normal just flows as it normally would as far as collapsing goes. The pre preserves the white space just as the pre-element of HTML would. The only difference is all the formatting is whatever is indicated for that element. Remember, the pre-element before would type it in the same as you were typing it, which in Notepad++ is a monospace font. So you would not see that monospace font with this white space with the value of pre. You would see however you intended it to look. And no wrap just breaks the text onto a new line only if explicitly told to do so with a break element. Otherwise it doesn't wrap. So we got 3 examples here. The normal, then we use the pre, we have it in a paragraph tag. So this is not going to change how this text looks. It's not going to look like this. It's going to look like the default, which probably is Times New Roman or Arial. We'll have to look. But as far as the spacing, it will maintain that. And in the last one, there's no wrap. We'll change the browser size so you can see that work. In our style sheet, the body actually has everything defined as Arial or Verdana. So in this white space then with the pre, the spacing will hold true, but it'll still look like Arial as opposed to looking the way it's typed in the actual document. And then no wrap is going to prohibit it from wrapping no matter what the size of the window or container is. You can see that it's still Arial, but it maintained the spacing. And if we change the browser size here, you can see that it did not wrap when the browser changed. Normally it does. You can see on the top where it wasn't changed, we didn't use any of this, it wraps as the browser window size decreases. But it did not do that for this one because we used the no wrap. Then we have the direction property. It's like the direction attribute, which specifies the direction in which the text should flow. This is not going to do exactly what you might think it's going to do. It has a left to right a right to left value, and an inherit that just allows the text to flow the same direction as its parent element. Both IE and Firefox, Chrome actually should be added in there as well. Safari should be added in there as well. Use this property much as the align attribute does. The value of right to left simply right aligns text. The only difference is that the period, or the full stop if you will, is to the left of the sentence in the paragraph that is supposed to be running right to left. The line height property. This is actually going to be talked about next week in one of the videos as well, but it was appropriate to put it here, I felt, instead of where they have it in the book. But it just is used to adjust the space between the lines. Like the line height equal to 150%. That's 1.5 times what it normally is, or 1.5 EM could be used for the same thing. You can use any type of measurement you'd use with text sizing. Percentages or EMs are better. That way, if they need to, they can change according to and along with the text font size as well. The normal line height for a browser is 120%. That's 1.2 EMs. Now that means from baseline to baseline. So from the baseline of one line to the baseline of the next line, it's going to be 120% of whatever the text height is, or 1.2 EMs from baseline to baseline. You can use just a number in this case. You don't have to use percentage or EM or PX or anything else. Line height of 1.5 would be the same as 150%. And line height is inherited. So we'll just look at an example here. We have 3 paragraphs, the class of 1, 2, and 3. If we look at the style sheet in paragraph 1, that's going to be left alone. That's just going to be normal. In line 2, we're going to make the line height 16 pixels. And in line 3, we're going to make it 28 pixels. So looking at this in our browser, you can see the normal. Compare that to the 16 pixels, which is a little bit more space, and the 24 pixel, which is a lot more space. Now the last thing, looking at text formatting, there is a shortcut for all these. Instead of having to actually define the font style, font variant, font weight, font size, line height, and font family on individual lines, you can actually do that on one line using the font property. It says attribute there, that's incorrect. The font property. So in the example that's here, we're going to set everything to italic, bold, small caps. It's going to be 18 pixels in text size with 150% line height, and it's going to use Arial or Helvetica or the default sans serif. You do not have to include each attribute, but it must include the font size and font family. So at minimum, it has to have the font size, which is represented by 18 pixels here, and the font family, which is Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. You only use a single space between each property value, no commas. The only commas are to separate the fonts from one another. The same as if you were putting them in a style sheet using the font family. When specifying the line height, you add a / after the font size followed by that value. And then the last 2 properties must be font size, or if you're using the line height, font size / line height followed by the font family. So no matter whether you use any of these, doesn't matter whether you use one, none, or all of them, these 2 always have to be at the end. Other than that, you could put them in any way you want. There's also 2 pseudo-classes that will help you work with text, and we're actually going to talk more about other pseudo-classes as they occur. But here, since we're talking about manipulating text or formatting text, we're going to add these two in here. They're attached, first of all, to the selector that you're going to use by using a colon. So instead of the selector just being P in this case, it's going to be P colon first letter. No spaces on either side of the colon. So that's what your selector would look like. The first letter enables you to specify a rule just for the first letter of an element. There's also the first line, which if we stick with the same example, P colon first line, that would enable you to render the first line of any paragraph differently from the rest of the paragraph. So you can see we have one paragraph, has a class of page 1, and we're going to apply both of these to that same page, or that same paragraph. And we're going to apply both of these to the same paragraph. Here, the P dot page 1 colon first letter. We're going to get more into this next week, but that's basically the first letter of any paragraph tag with a class of page 1. Don't worry too much about this. We will talk about this next week extensively. But we're setting the font size to 42 pixels and the width of that first character to 200 pixels. So we're going to have a large letter. The first line is going to make the font weight bold. We could also, to make it stand out even more, do a color and just make it red, make it really stand out. So if we look at this in our browser, you can see the O as being much bigger and that first line being red and bold. Now, when we talk about first line here, it's not the first line in your code. If that was the case, it would only be red and bold up to the word different. But as you can see, it's red all except for the last hyphen word, pseudo-classes. And indeed, if I change my browser size, you can see the difference. As I change the size, it's only the first line that appears in the browser. So it may be different on everyone's browser depending on what the size of their screen is. So that takes care of formatting text. We got one more video for this week in Chapter 7 that looks at the selectors and the lengths that we've been talking about throughout the first 4 parts of this chapter. And then the rest of the chapter will be covered next week.